uh, I was born in Amsterdam, and that was in 1942. So that was still in the war. And so my parents lived in Amsterdam, and especially the last year of the war was pretty rough, because then there was not that much to eat, but we made it through. And shortly after, I don't remember much or anything actually. Shortly after the war, we moved to a small village about 20 miles north of Amsterdam. My father was an electrician. He found work there. And I went to kindergarten and to the elementary school, and then went to secondary school, which actually was quite an event in that village, because no one had yet gone from that school to the secondary school, which was in a nearby town in Alkmaar, about 7 miles away, which I cycled in the morning and in the afternoon. And strangely enough, the wind was always against me. It would always turn again in the course of the day. Well, then in those years, we moved, as I think I said last week, we moved into a windmill, because that was the cheapest place that one could find to live. My father had become sick and could no longer work any longer, and so we were looking for a place that was cheap. Well, as I mentioned last week, he died when he was 50. We lived there in the small windmill with our family. I had 3 sisters, and so we lived there until actually I went to our small seminary that we had in the Netherlands at that time. And that is also where I met Aafje, who was there in the secondary school. And so we were there for a few years together. Then I went to Newbold to finish my bachelor's. And in the last year that I was at Newbold, we got married. And then we decided to go to the United States. And that was quite an adventure, of course. We had to find $1,000 to get there, because that was you had to have that in order to get your visa. And so together we went to Sweden to canvass, and we just managed to scrape the $1,000 together. And so we spent a full year then at Andrews, and I got my master's there. And well, by that time, you know, the first 25 years are about full. And we were going back. And so, but we had to work a little bit before going back, because we were completely on our own financially. The Netherlands Union did not sponsor students at that time, and certainly not students who wanted to do graduate work, because they felt that was a waste of money and a waste of time. And actually, they were not happy about our going to the States, because they said, well, if you go there, then you'll be lost for the work in the Netherlands. Well, I don't know that we were completely lost for the work in the Netherlands, because we still managed to work about a little more than our active working life in the Netherlands. So that's where we are. And maybe Aafje should say a little bit now, or maybe next week.
Aafje, where were you born, and how, your first 25 years?
I was born in The Hague, and well, my father was treasurer of the Dutch Union, and we moved quite a bit to different towns because the office moved. And I spent part of my youth in Utrecht, went to secondary school there, and afterwards to secondary school of our own college. The seminary had part of a secondary school as well. So that's what I did, and that's where I met Reinder. And when we went, a little anecdote, if I may, we had to go to the American Embassy in Stockholm in order to get our visas for the States. But we were poor as mice. My watch had broken down, and so I had my alarm clock in my pocket in order to keep all the appointments. And right in the office of the ambassador, my alarm clock went off.
And that happened today. We would probably haven't been shot at, you know, by the security. Yeah.
They would have thought it's a ticking bomb.
Yeah.
Everything went all right, and yeah, I started studying art at Andrews in the college, but we were self-supporting, so there was soon not enough money, and that was the end of my enterprise. And and then we went back to the Netherlands and moved to our first place where Reinder was a pastor, and got our daily cater, the first one.
You assured us that it was not love at first sight last week. You want to say anything more about that?
It was not love at first sight, absolutely. But anyhow, it turned out all right.
Okay.
It's good to know.
Anybody have a question for Afia or for Reinder? I have three real quick ones. How did your family become Adventists?
Well, I think as far as Afia is concerned, her parents became Adventists somewhere along the line.
My father became an Adventist because he worked at an Adventist enterprise.
Oh yeah, he had an Adventist employer, didn't he?
And then he met my mother later, and well, he liked her, and in the end, she became an Adventist because there was no way that they would be married without her being an Adventist. And they went together at first. She was canvassing even.
Wow. Okay.
My mother was an Adventist. I think she became an Adventist when she was about 17. And then when she became, she worked for a Jewish family in Amsterdam in the housekeeping. That was what many Adventist girls would do to find work. They would go and try to find a Jewish family where they could work and keep Sabbath. And in that period, I think my mother was about 25. She met my father, and they got married, and he became a Seventh-day Adventist after that.
Okay, second question. Thank you. What was it like to live in a windmill?
Terrible. It's cold and windy and small. It looks very, interesting from the outside, but living in such a place is not really a great thing. So, no.
That's a disappointment.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. Third question. Why did you decide to go to graduate school on your own rather than go into pastoring? Because I suspect that you got more than a little resistance when you came up with that idea.
We did actually, but still, I was just interested in doing it. And we felt that if we were not going to do it straight away, it would probably not happen. And so actually, when we were in the States, I had almost finished my master's. Then Dr. Kubo, you know him, no doubt.
Yes.
He talked me into applying for Chicago, the Divinity School in Chicago. And I was actually accepted there, but there was no way we could pay for that. So when we had finished the master's, then it took a while before I could go on with graduate work, further graduate. Yeah.
Yes. Dr. Kubo's from Hawaii, as am I, so our paths crossed way back then, way back then. Well, okay. Any other questions from anybody? So that's good enough for the first 25 years. The next 25 years, we will pick up next time. And I now recall what I was going to say, and that is I put in the email for you 4 videos that Dr. Bruinsma did on postmodernism. And they're not these little brief ones that I've been sending out, but they're 50 minutes, 40 minutes, 4 different lectures he gave on postmodernism. And I haven't watched them yet, but I plan to. And I also thought that in the future, we might have some sessions in which we play those and then interact with Dr. Bruinsma after that. We don't have to ask him to redo those lectures. We could play the lectures and then we could have a conversation subsequent to the lecture. And I think postmodernism is interesting enough and important enough that it deserves some careful reflection. Some Christians are very hostile to it. Some see postmodernism as a way of articulating the Christian faith better than ever. So
you better first watch them, before you get too enthusiastic.
I'm sorry?
You better first watch the videos before you get too enthusiastic.
Oh yeah, I think I'll be fine. I'll be fine. Okay, so we can think about that for down in the future. And so now we go to Dr. Bruinsma's second presentation on his book, I Have a Future. We have a few more copies, so if you would want some for your friends or relatives, send us a notice because we have a few that we can share. And again, don't send us any money. Just make a contribution to the Sabbath School before the year's out. Thank you. Okay, here we go to Dr. Bruinsma.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. It worked last week, so it should work again. Okay, okay.
Here it is.
It is, but it has the conclusion, doesn't it, rather than the beginning?
Yeah, but if you click Start Slideshow up at the top, it'll go to the thing. There you go.
Okay, and then, so I got rid of the sidebar, I believe.
Yes.
It's visible for everybody.
Yeah, this is a controversial one, Reinder.
Okay.
This is controversial.
Well, we made a start with our series last week, and this is the second one. I Have a Future, the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So last week, what do Adventists believe about death? Today, can we be sure that Christ is risen? Just trying to do something here. Yeah. And then we changed the series a little bit. Initially, I was not supposed to be here on June 20. And so we skip a week. But it turns out that we are still not able to travel we were expected to go to Denmark. But whereas most of the borders in Europe are now coming open, there's still a few places where they don't want any people from Holland. And there are a few places where we still cannot go. So I'm free next week to do the third topic. Can we be sure that we will be resurrected? Talk about resurrection and about if we are bodily resurrected, what kind of body that will be. And then June 27, what will everlasting life be like? So that's what we plan to do in the coming weeks. Trying to, okay. So, what is it, the resurrection of Christ? Is it a reality or is it a myth? Some people have concluded that the resurrection never happened. It's not reality. It is myth. It's a legend. It's symbolic. But whatever it is, it's not historic. People use arguments like, well, you know, miracles simply don't happen. So this unbelievable miracle of the resurrection certainly could not have happened. Others say, well, look at the gospel stories. They are not credible. They are inconsistent. And we spoke a little bit about that last week. But on the other hand, there are reputable theologians, and I have just listed 3 of them, but there are many more who defend the historicity of the resurrection narrative. Wolfhard Pannenberg, a famous Lutheran theologian, John Macquarie, Scottish-born Anglican, and more recently, he is still alive, N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. Some of his books he signs as N.T. Wright, and some of his books he signs as Tom Wright. He has been Bishop of Durham for a number of years. He's taught in many places, and now he is the scholar in residence at Andrews University in Scotland. He's written this marvelous book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, in 2003. And he has written a more popular version of that, which is called Surprised by Joy. And that is a fabulous book. And there have been many other reputable theologians also who have defended the historicity of the narrative. But on the other hand, there are some who don't, and we'll come to that. Many theologians who accept the historicity say that we shouldn't worry too much about the inconsistencies. The stories complement each other. Supernatural events may appear differently to different observers. And I'm quoting Tom Wright. He said, indeed, there is a reasonable indication that something remarkable happened, so remarkable that the first witnesses were bewildered into telling different stories about it. Dorothy Sayers, I don't know whether you have read any of her detective stories. It's a little bit dated now, but maybe the older participants at this session have read some of her books, detective stories, but at the same time, she was also a competent theologian. And she wrote quite a bit about the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I suppose that comes also from her knowledge of detective stories, that stories of witnesses usually differ in detail. So she wasn't worried about that at all. Now, there have been numerous, or at least several, explanations that get away from the miraculous element and say there's another explanation for it, for what happened, for what is written in the Gospels. So some say the tomb was empty because the disciples had come during the night and had stolen Christ's body. And that was an idea that circulated even very early in apostolic times, and it has circulated later. But is it really imaginable that the disciples, from all we know about them, that they could have orchestrated such a deception? It doesn't sound very logical. Others say Jesus' body must have been stolen by the Jewish or by the Roman authorities. And of course, that explanation is even more unlikely.
He continues doing so outside.
Somebody came on. May I ask whoever came on? Welcome. But how about turning on your mute?
The individual, and they walk 5 city blocks without using deadly force.
Yeah, somebody needs to turn off his mic.
A very notable principle to abide by if you're a Camden County police officer.
Okay, 1 second. I'll try to find out who it is. I don't know why I can't mute everybody, but I should be able to. Let,
At that moment, it is your job, because if not, you're as one that can also.
So both these two guys, and what you guys want to do is, if you heard someone, and they were being peaceful, you would report them.
okay, let me find out what's going on here.
And you do the same thing to him.
I expect nothing less.
Huh. Okay, who is not muted?
So both these two guys, and what you guys want to do is, if you heard someone.
Bronwyn's not muted, but I don't think she.
I would probably take the badge out of his chest at that moment because it says service.
It sounds like there is a radio or television on
And you do
somewhere.
the same thing to him.
Yeah.
I expect nothing less.
David, I only see.
Okay, everybody mute. Be sure you're muting.
With cops.
And once again, I.
Different.
Yes, they're very different. They shit is nice, polite, and
David,
There is criticism though.
everybody, and
Police
then
doesn't have enough minority officers.
you can unmute the presenter
They may
only.
not be responsible for the crime drop.
Yeah, but my problem is I don't have a way to mute everybody.
crime statistics have been going down.
I'm
about-
going. You folk all stay here, okay?
and has been going
Don't
down
run away.
for
I'm going to run away and see what I can
So
find
I would
out.
not credit that with the policing program that has.
You have to find out who's the host of the
Former
meeting.
police chief
Only
says
the
department
host can mute
improve
everybody.
while keeping its principles.
I think that most of the police officers here get it. Every once in a while, we get one that doesn't. And we move swiftly and with certainty to remove.
I wonder if Forrest is the true host. And
The conversation on race
is
continues
Bronwyn
tomorrow
on
night
with
right
us?
here on
Because
CNN.
that's one of the
We're
few,
at
Bronwyn is one of the few
Nation's
people
top
not
mayors.
muted that,
Washington's Maria Bowser, Atlanta's Keisha Lance Bottoms,
So I don't know.
Chicago's Lori Lightfoot, and San Francisco's
There
London.
are 3 people now
Leaders will gather
unmuted
tomorrow night
that
at
I
9.
see on the bottom of the list.
Comfortable design makes it beautiful.
They can save you $2,000 a year. That's me. There's no income verification, no appraisal, and no out-of-pocket costs.
That's me.
Put your VA home loan benefits to good use. Call my team at New Day USA.
Call 1-888-910-5063.
All right,
Every
David
Metrovac
back.
product is deliberately made better in the USA to help you detail your ride, and groom your pets, to keep your home clean.
Oh my, I'm sorry.
David,
We make your
Yeah.
life easier, and our products
are you
built to
on the
last decades.
Branson Legacy
It's
Sabbath
more
School?
important to support the American economy.
Are you on the Branson Legacy Sabbath School? Because this is the code.
Your American-made products at
Uh,
Metrovac.com.
Dating can feel like it has a lot of rules, but with
Go to
there it is.
participants. Go to
Yeah.
participants.
how you want.
No, he's not. David Branson is
eHarmony and
not on the Sabbath School. Oh, now yeah.
Every time I hear sounds, it looks like it's highlighted on Bronwyn's. Bronwyn is highlighted, so it sounds like the sound is coming from that one. Unmuted.
Okay, yeah, that's it.
Okay.
It seems okay now.
Okay, then we'll try. So I was saying that some have said that the disciples had stolen the body of Christ, that idea was circulated to explain the empty tomb on Sunday morning, while others have said, no, it was the Roman authorities or the Jewish authorities. They had taken away the body of Christ. But, you know, if they had done that, then when the story began to grow in the days after the resurrection and soon after that, then no doubt they would have been eager to produce Jesus' body to show that the story of the resurrection was bogus. So those are not very good explanations. Then there was a so-called swoon theory, which was proposed by a German, Carl Venturini, And that theory, very speculative, is still being proposed by some, still has supporters. And these people, and often they are scholars, they say, well, Jesus did not really die on the cross, but he was in a state of what they call suspended animation when he was laid into the tomb. And then in the cool, damp air of the tomb, he came back to consciousness. And then a group of Jesus supporters on Sunday morning, dressed in white, visited the tomb. And then suddenly they heard groaning from inside the tomb. They panicked, and then the Roman guards rescued Jesus. And that's the story of the resurrection.
You're not picking up anymore.
Well, I don't know whether that sounds very convincing to you, but it certainly doesn't to me. Others have said, well, the resurrection and especially the appearances, they were the result of hallucinations. The followers of Jesus, they could simply not believe that Christ was no longer with them, that was all what they had experienced was the end. And so their sense of grief translated into visionary experiences that seemed so real to them that they came to believe that Christ had come back from the dead. Well, that doesn't sound all that convincing either. And you know, when that type of things happen, they don't suddenly stop. I don't know whether you remember, you know, was it the 50s or the 60s when everybody saw flying saucers? And, you know, the more this was talked about, the more people saw, and you could have expected that at the time of Jesus' appearances, that when people told about the appearances, that others would say, yes, I've seen the same, etc., etc. So those are some of the explanations that people have brought forward to say, no, it's not historical, it's something else. But okay, is it historical, and how much is historical? The German historian Leopold von Ranke in the 19th century, he laid the basis for the modern approach to the study of history. And one of his famous statements is that history must find out wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, how it has in fact happened. And so this idea of how it in fact happened was caught on by theologians, and this started the so-called, or gave impetus to the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. How much of the gospel stories is actually historical, reliable? The thing became very well known when Albert Schweitzer wrote a seminal study about this, his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, a critical study of its progress from Reimaris to Rede. Now, this Reimaris was in the 14th century, so he goes back quite a bit. But this really got started moving, in particular in the 19th century, the quest for the historical Jesus. And then for a while, it got less, but people speak of a second quest in the 1950s to 1970s, and then a third quest even after the 1980s. Part of the third quest for the historical Jesus was the so-called Jesus Seminar. And that had its greatest popularity between the 1980s and 1990s. A group of some 70 plus, mainly American, but not only American scholars, plus a number of lay persons, they met regularly over a period of 6 years. Their goal was to determine how much of Jesus' statements, how many of these statements were authentic. And well, they rejected the historicity of all the miracles that were ascribed to Jesus. That simply could not have happened. After analyzing all Jesus' words that were reported in the Gospels, they concluded that about 82% of these statements were not actually spoken by the Lord himself. So this is also part of the quest of the historical Jesus, trying to find out how much of it has actually happened, how much was actually historical. When we talk about these things, one of the persons whose name should always be mentioned, that is the German theologian Rudolf Bultmann. You know, there are lots of theologians that have come from Germany, and that's always interesting to think, why was it that in some countries they have produced so many musical talents, and why in some countries they have produced so many theological talent? Well, Germany is certainly well known for its theology, for the persons, that the many theologians it has brought forth. Rudolf Bultmann, well known for his demythologizing of the New Testament. He said we should separate fact from fiction, from myth. The gospel must be, the myth must be taken away, demythologized. And so he believed that crucifixion was historical, but then the resurrection was definitely not historical. And he says a historical fact which involves a resurrection from the dead is utterly inconceivable. So the resurrection, that cannot be historic because it's utterly inconceivable. That did not mean that for Bultmann, Christ was not important, but he separated the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. And so here we are. Many Christians, many denominations, they are unsure, do not know what actually to believe. They wonder, could it really happen? Are the stories about the resurrection historically reliable? And of course, as we said last time, it's a crucial question, because the entire Christian message that we can have eternal life depends on the certainty that Christ rose from the dead and thereby conquered death once and for all. But some feel that the Christian message continues to be meaningful, even if it is not based on historical facts. And they want to believe in this distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. But many Christians wonder, well, what do these theologians mean when they say that, when they make that separation between the Jesus who is part of history and the Christ who is the subject, the object rather, of our faith? Well, the question then that we are talking about is, was the resurrection indeed a historical event? And first of all, then, we need to ask the question, what does the word historical mean? Well, history, it seeks for objective facts, but at the same time, it is always selective, because when you write history, you cannot write about everything that happened, but you must take certain things, you must be selective and put them in a certain order and in a certain perspective. It makes a lot of difference who writes history about a particular topic. You know, when you take the Crusades, it makes a lot of difference whether that is written from a Western perspective or whether that is written from the Middle Eastern perspective. The discovery of America, well, there are some who are not that happy about Columbus even in the Western world. And I heard on the news yesterday that in some places they want to remove the statue of Christopher because they feel he is part of a very dubious past. But certainly, most of us look at Columbus differently from the way the indigenous population of the United States look at Columbus. You know, the Dutch and the English, they both were nations that had great maritime interests in the 17th and 18th century. And we were often, you know, not really agreeing as to how we should cooperate. And so there were wars between the Dutch and the English, and we have 4 wars that we learned about in primary school and later in secondary school. And when we got the history of those 4 wars, we felt rather proud because, you know, the Dutch won them all. Now later, we lived in England for a number of years, and you know, when you live somewhere, you want to know a little bit about the history, more about the history of the country where you live. And so I bought a few books on the history of Great Britain and looked at those wars. Well, they call them the English wars rather than the Dutch, the Dutch wars. Well, we call them the English wars. They call them the Dutch wars. And from their books, you get the impression that we didn't do so great and that the English really did a much lot better than the Dutch did. It depends on your perspective, how you look at the same facts. Biblical history in the Bible is a particular kind of history. It is biblical history, salvation history, sometimes called the history of redemption. What that means is that the primary perspective of the history in the Bible is not what happened in the world, but how has God dealt with his people? And how have people responded to him? History is written with that theme in mind. And that is a filter through which the historical facts were selected and interpreted. The fact that the data, the facts are selected, you find that also in the New Testament. Luke is the one who most clearly presents himself as a historian who selects. And that is true of all the other gospel writers as well. They did not all experience the facts themselves, but they gathered them and listened to other witnesses, and that gave form to the gospel stories. That is how Bible history, how the history of the New Testament was written. John says, and it's rather, you know, an exaggeration, but at the end of his gospel, he says that it's simply impossible to write down all the things that Jesus did and said. In John 21, he says, Jesus did many other things as well. It's at the end of his gospel. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world could not have room for the books that would be written. Now, that's a little bit of an hyperbolic statement, but it shows that John had to select. And as those who study the book of John know, he selected according to particular theological interest that he had. Find the same in the book of Acts, written by Luke, historian of, you know, wrote 2 books, his gospel and the book of Acts. And well, we know that the book of Acts is not really a book of Acts of all the apostles, but mainly centers on Peter and Paul. And of course, on some of the things that he experienced himself as he was traveling with Paul. So it's very selective in what it deals. But then, you know, if we ask the question, is the book of Acts historically reliable? We can say, yes, it is. But at the same time, it's very personal and it's an interpretation of the facts. Those are some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about, is something that the Bible describes historical? Something else that I would like to mention is that in Jesus we have something that is very unique. And there are unique events at the beginning of his life on earth and at the end of his life on earth. We're not dealing with simple historic facts in the regular sense of the word. No, when Jesus was born, well, we have no record of his birth. And we know that the stories about his birth are miraculous, the incarnation, a woman becoming pregnant without having intercourse with a man. It was a miraculous beginning, a unique beginning, and the same is true at the end of his life. You know, there's no photograph of Jesus as he left the tomb, and somebody said that if there had been a photograph, that would have been certainly overexposed by what happened. But when we look at the question, can we say that the resurrection is historical? Then I would like to say that it is to be expected that something extraordinary would happen when, on the one hand, the living word comes to this world, becomes incarnated, and then also at the end of his earthly life, when he is resurrected. These are unique events, but the fact that they are unique, the fact that there is no comparison, that in itself does not mean that they could not have happened, that they are not historical. So then, if it is not history in the ordinary sense of the word, like other events, then that does not mean that it did not happen, it could not happen. Because after all, I say it again, Jesus was unique. He was the only begotten Son of God, so that we can expect that some extraordinary, unique things would happen. A German theologian, again a German, Walter Künneth, he asserted that revelation is not detached from history. He believes that the resurrection was historical, but he says it's always more than history. And something similar, like Karl Barth, again a German, who says that we cannot understand the resurrection only in terms of a historical event, since it was of a totally different order, and it can only be accepted by faith. He says faith is needed to make sense of what happened on the Easter morning. So if we say that faith is needed, if it's more than history, does that mean that we should simply skip any further inquiry into the facts of the resurrection? I don't think so, but it must be clear from the outset that there will never be absolute evidence that will answer all the questions. And if there were such final irrefutable evidence, of course, we would no longer need faith. But the fact that there is no final rational explanation for the resurrection of Jesus does not mean that belief in a risen Lord is irrational. I refer again to a man that whose name I mentioned last week, I think, the Christian Reformed theologian Alvin Plantinga, who says that there's no solid evidence for everything that we believe, for all the doctrines that we have put together. No solid evidence for the existence of God and all the other things that we find is important. But he says there are convincing arguments for accepting what he calls warranted beliefs. There is enough reason to believe that these things are true. And so there is nothing inherently illogical, he says, in believing that God exists, that he interacts with us, and likewise, there is nothing illogical, inherently illogical, in believing that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. He would also put that in the category of warranted beliefs. So then, let's check the facts and let's come to some kind of verdict on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, that Jesus was a historical figure There's no doubt about that. There is consensus among the historians that Jesus lived for a number of years at the time that the Bible tells us and in the area that the Bible tells us about. The Gospels, admittedly, are the primary sources. There's not that much outside of the Bible. There's some, but the Gospels are our primary sources about Jesus' ministry on earth, his resurrection, and his subsequent appearances to a number of people. Yeah, we must admit also that these documents, the Gospels, they were written by believers. They were not objective, you might say. They were subjective as they made their selection of the events they wanted to report. And that gives the Gospel a very special flavor. But that doesn't mean that they are automatically legends or myths. And we should note that the Gospels were written quite soon after the events, a generation after these events occurred. When we look at the Gospel narratives, we can see that no attempt has been made by the authors themselves, or the redactors, to remove any inconsistencies or differences. And what adds quite a bit of weight to the value of the early manuscripts is that there are so many of them. There are many more ancient manuscripts of the Gospels than of most or any other writings of the early centuries. The authenticity of the Gospel stories is further considerably strengthened by the fact that they tell us that the first people to whom Christ appeared were women. Now, if this story would not have been true, if it would have been concocted, then probably the part of the women would have been left out. The first witnesses would have been males. That would have been much easier to swallow. And at least they should have been mentioned alongside with the women, or even more so, the testimony of the women would have been left out completely. In the first century, simply the testimony of women was of very little worth. So if the story had been made up, then the inclusion of these women on the Sunday morning coming to the tomb, being the first witnesses of the resurrection, that would certainly have been left out. I have a little difficulty sometimes getting to the next screen, but here we are. There is an interesting text at the end of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 28. And there we read, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus has told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." Now, these last three words are very interesting. If it had been made up, if it had been a story that is just the result of imagination, or was not connected with what actually happened, then it's hardly conceivable that this statement would have been made, but some doubted. That would certainly have been left out. So we find that, and that for me is really the thing to emphasize, the thing that is most important. A group of people who had been totally demoralized after the crucifixion and burial of Jesus became convinced that Jesus had risen and that they should no longer seek the living one among the dead. whatever we think, that is what happened. They were demoralized, but soon afterwards, they were convinced that Jesus had risen and that he was alive. Now, some said, as we have mentioned, that this conviction was based on some cleverly concocted conspiracy or collective hallucination, but another explanation, namely that the resurrection actually happened, sounds far more reasonable and credible. I want to quote from a few authors who have given us their conviction about the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, Frank Morrison. He's a lawyer. He has been dead for some time. He died in 1950, but his book is still worth reading, Who Moved the Stone? He decided to analyze all the evidence he could find of Jesus' resurrection. As a result, he changed from a skeptic into a believer. And so now in this book, he asks his readers. He says, I do not want to minimize the character of the historic nucleus from which Christianity sprang. But, and here's his question, seriously, does this rather heterogeneous body of simple folk, the disciples, reeling under the shock of the crucifixion, reeling under the shock of the utter degradation and death of their leader, does this group look like the driving force we require to establish the church? And the answer is obvious. All of you probably know this, the author, Philip Yancey. He is not an academic, really, but he is a gifted writer. And some of his books are very worthwhile to read. I have enjoyed in particular his book, What's So Amazing About Grace? But also his book, The Jesus I Never Know, is really a fine book. And he says that Jesus succeeded in changing a snuffling band of unreliable followers into fearless evangelists. That 11 men who had deserted him at death now went into martyrs' graves, avowing their death in a resurrection Christ. That these few witnesses managed to set loose a force that would overcome fierce opposition, first in Jerusalem and then in Rome. This remarkable sequence of transformation offers the most convincing evidence of the resurrection. It's quite a statement. Tom Wright, whom I quoted earlier, he said it very succinctly in a few words. He said, the disciples were hardly likely to go out and suffer and die for a belief that was not firmly anchored in fact. And we see indeed that, you know, these men, what we know about these men is that they were at first not convinced. Take Peter. He denied his Lord. And a few weeks later, we read it in Acts 2, he addresses a multinational, multicultural crowd of thousands in Jerusalem, saying that Christ was alive. So something must have happened that gave him the conviction and the power to do that. You know, what about our doubting Thomas? He at first did not believe, but you know, there's good reason to believe. The tradition that he became a missionary eventually to India, where even today there are some 4 million Thomas Christians who remain a testimony of his radical conversion. Something happened to change these men, Peter and Thomas. You may not have heard, maybe some of you have, but maybe not all of you, of Pinchas Lapide. He was a Jewish theologian, Israeli historian, never became a Christian, but firmly believed that the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually did take place. He said that the resurrection is the only explanation for the birth and further rise of Christianity. And then he asked the questions to his readers. How can it be explained that against all plausibility, his adherents did not finally scatter, were not forgotten, and that the cause of Jesus did not reach its infamous end at the cross? And then I put it in red on the screen. How did it nevertheless come about that the adherents of Jesus were able to conquer the most horrible disappointments? That Jesus, despite of everything, became the savior of the church, although the predictions were not fulfilled and the longed for parousia did not take place. He concludes, the explanation of many resurrection-denying theologians fail miserably to explain the fact that these solid hillbillies from Galilee, as he calls them, were changed within a short period of time into a jubilant community of believers. And it continues, when this scared, frightened band of apostles, who was just about to throw everything away in despair, when the shepherds, peasants, and fishermen who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him miserably, suddenly could be changed overnight in a confident mission society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter, then no vision or hallucination is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation. And so then, what is the verdict? Excuse me. Sorry. Oops. Do we have enough evidence? Well, if we ask a question like that, do we have enough evidence? Then the answer would be no for people who cannot and do not want to be convinced, because they do not believe, do not accept that miracles can happen. Whatever the amount of evidence is going to be provided, nothing will be sufficient. So some will say, no, we cannot believe that this is historically reliable. But those who approach the Bible stories with an open mind, without preconceived ideas of what might or might not be possible, there is certainly a lot of evidence, I would say enough evidence. And taken together, the different elements that we have discussed, they make, I believe, a strong cumulative case. With Plantinga, whom I mentioned earlier, I consider faith in the resurrected Lord a warranted belief. No absolute proof, and we cannot get away from the fact that the resurrection is historical in a very special sense. And it is something unique that defies any comparison with other historical events. And that in the end, acceptance of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus requires faith. And faith implies the possibility of rejection. Otherwise, it wouldn't be faith. But the faith that Jesus' story did not end on Golgotha gives me the firm assurance that my story will not end in the cemetery or the crematorium to which my body will be delivered after my present life has ended. Faith in the resurrection of Jesus equals faith in the glorious fact that God did not let death win. And that, I think, is my presentation for today, David. David, still there? David, you're muted. Unmute. You must unmute.
There you go. How about that?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Who has the first question or comment? Okay. What about this idea of warranted belief? According to Plantinga, what features does warranted belief have that unwarranted belief doesn't have?
You asked me, or you asked?
I'll start with you. Yeah. He says we can't prove it, but it's warranted. Now that's a line of reasoning he uses on other things, but at other places he talks about basic beliefs. That is, things that are so certain that it's not possible to doubt them, and from which we reason rather than toward which we reason. So he has, this reformed epistemology that they call it is interesting, but I'm not sure that I understand the idea of saying, well, this claim is not true, but it is warranted. Anybody want to help? Go ahead.
He doesn't say this claim is not true, but it is warranted. He says this claim cannot be proven as such to be true. And fortunately, there are other claims about things, and when you put them together, you get a web of truth. It's like one of the American philosophers, and I always, forget whether you pronounce his name as Queen or Quine. He said that it's like a web. You have many threads. These threads in a spider's web, they in themselves are very vulnerable and not very strong. But when you put them together, the web becomes strong. And Plantinga, I think, also uses that idea that claims about things may in themselves not be absolute and may not be absolutely proven, but when you put them together, you can get a good case for the truth of Christianity and the major claims of Christianity.
Okay, somebody else want to jump in? Looks like Edwin, do you want to say something? No?
Yeah, I will say something.
Okay, Edwin, then Roger.
The story of doubting Thomas is so significant to me in that it reveals a characteristic of Jesus who says to Thomas, okay, put your finger here. In other words, he's saying to Thomas and to the rest of us that some people require more evidence than others. And Jesus did not frown on Thomas for saying that. I love that. And that's what I wanted to say.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that we find in other instances in the New Testament as well, that Jesus accepts that doubt is something that is just there. It's the other side of faith. And he does not condemn people who doubt. We know the story of John the Baptist. And he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, go ask him, are you the one that we expected, or did we expect somebody else? Because John is now in prison, and it seems that things have fallen apart. So he is doubting there. The great John the Baptist is doubting. But for Jesus, that is not, a matter of condemnation, but he helps John to overcome his doubt. And that is, I think, what he was willing to do with Thomas as well. But it remains significant that here we have people who deny Jesus, who deny or who cannot believe in the fact that Jesus is truly risen, and yet a few weeks later they are champions of the risen Christ. And so I feel this is a very, very strong argument that to say that whatever it was, but something very, very spectacular, and that can only be the truth, the historicity, the fact that the resurrection actually took place, that convinced them, that made it to have the moral courage, stamina. And you know, all of them, except John, probably died a martyr's death. And the fact that they were willing to do that, and even John did not have that easy a life with his imprisonment at Patmos, etc., etc. The fact that these people were willing to undergo this, that is very significant. As some of the writers whom I quoted say, that people do not do that for something that is not something that they are convinced is factual.
Thank you, Roger. And then who's next after Roger? Go ahead, Roger.
Elder, I really have appreciated your book. I've been reading it, and it has been a real blessing, and has strengthened my faith in the presentations, and I really appreciate it. The question I had, and it just came to mind, may be irrelevant, but I'm thinking of the Muslim faith, and as I understand it, they believe that Muhammad went to heaven on a white horse. Is that true? And that I'm wondering, what is it that gives them such strength in their belief?
Well, whether he went to heaven on a white horse, that's a different story, of course. When we say that Christians have been able to be very courageous and have been able to suffer a martyr's death, etc., that does not mean that there is no courage and there is no things that can be admired in other faith communities as well. And well, we, as we are sitting here, or rather sitting everywhere, but are united by Zoom, we believe that the story of Christ is unique and cannot be compared to the other stories. That is not to say that these other stories are totally worthless, and that, whether Muhammad will be eventually in heaven, we'll find out. But
well, I guess what I'm asking, could it be that maybe Muhammad did go to heaven on a white horse? I mean, is there any evidence that he didn't, or is there going to be credibility to it?
Well, I don't think he did, but really, I am not totally familiar with those topics, and so I would rather have people who know more about that speak to that topic. And I know there are some in the class than I would do that. What I would be prepared to say is that I am convinced of the superiority of Christianity, that is the most cohesive story, but that the other stories certainly also have value and cannot only be written off as pagan or whatever.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
McKinley would like to go.
McKinley.
Yes.
And then after McKinley, Ladon.
Thank you again so much, Brother Reinder, right?
Reinder, yes, got it.
Thank you for another excellent presentation on the resurrection. I especially appreciated the critical review considering the pros and the cons. What I find interesting is that most of the defense of the resurrection, whether Christ's or the future resurrection of the saints, is based on the historicity of record and the testimony of the disciples. I think doubters and secularists don't see a physical pathway to the outcome of the resurrection, and this creates this barrier for those people. I have reasoned that there is a physical pathway to the resurrection in all of the renewals, for example, healing outcomes in the scriptures. I wouldn't go into that here, but I think it adds to the case for your warranted belief. Now, why do you think that the church and those who argue for the validity of the resurrection have not focused on the physical pathways for the resurrection outcomes?
Mm-hmm.
Would you, McKinley, did you ask a question, or
Yes.
or were you making that right at the end? It seemed to me that you asked a question.
Yes, I did ask a question at the end.
Okay, what was it again, please?
Why does Reinder think that the church and those who defend the outcome of the resurrection have not looked at the physical pathways as part of the explanation?
Do you, I don't know that I understand what the physical pathways are. Could you say more about that? Then we'll have our Reinder respond to it.
Okay, good. So the physical pathways that I am talking about have to do with considerations of energy and entropy. So for example, death we understand to be the ultimate expression of entropy. In thermodynamics, we know that there are reversibilities, or there are physical pathways to reversibility outcomes. And so if thermodynamically, entropy can be reversed, and if death is the ultimate expression of entropy, then I think at God's level, there is a potential pathway for the reversal of death. Does that help?
Okay, so the second law of thermodynamics sets up the context for the resurrection of Jesus. What that does, it doesn't establish the resurrection of Jesus, but the idea of entropy and then entropy being reversed casts doubt on the doubt of the resurrection of Jesus. It's a very, very interesting thing. Now, Reinder's comment was historical. Not in physics, but what would you like to say about that, Reinder?
Well, I'm not sure that I know too much about entropy and everything that goes with it, but I would say that the element of life and death, death is everywhere in our present world, has come and has pervaded everything, and we see it all around us, and we see it in us. At the same time, the life that Christ brings, and that he brings in a definite and absolute way at the end of time in the resurrection and in the new world to come, that to some extent can be already experienced in the here and now as the kingdom that is future, but is also already within us. So in that sense, there is well, let's say a promise of life, and a promise of life more abundantly.
Okay, let's pause. Eduardo, please turn off your, Eduardo, please mute yourself.
David?
Yes.
Just one quick other comment. So the reason that I asked that question is because when I've had conversations with some of my friends in the secular research community, and I present that framework, the usual response is, oh, I haven't thought about the resurrection that way, or I haven't thought about a healing outcome that way, meaning that these can be seen as different stages of the reversal of entropy. And then that opens up a conversation for going into the scriptural basis that we rely upon as Christians, in particular as Seventh-day Adventist Christians.
Well, I can see the point. There's a discipline called negative theology, and Reinder can say that in Latin. But the purpose of negative theology is not to establish the belief as such, but to clear the conceptual groundwork of all the bushes that would make conceptual belief impossible. So,
exactly.
So this I can see the line of reasoning that's being followed here. If one says that it's in principle, the laws of physics makes it in principle impossible for the resurrection to occur, and then you come along and say, well, but the second law of thermodynamics suggests, and my understanding of it suggests that it can be reversed, well, then maybe we better take a second look at this idea of resurrection.
That is
now,
correct.
It doesn't prove the resurrection, but it casts much doubt on the doubt of resurrection. I think that's the point.
Yes, you're correct.
It shows that there is some reading to be done.
Okay. But the idea, Reinder, of doing negative theology, what do you say, theologica negativa? When you do that, you're just trying to clear off the space. It's like, I want to build a house, but I have to move all this rubbish first, then I can build my house. So that's what's, I think, going on here, if I understand McKinley correctly. Ladan.
But at the same time, you know, this via negativa, of course, it's easier to say what is not than what is there.
Right.
So, and in the end, a lot of our theology amounts to that, because, you know, when we speak about God, and about his natures and his attributes, then it is so much easier to say what is not than what is actually actually there, you know. And even when you have named something, and when you have established something, then you have to take a step back and say, well, still, I'm only using human words, and it's more complicated. It's deeper than what I can say with my human words.
But I do think you're right that one way to describe God is not to say what God is, but to come up with a whole list of things that God is not.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like somebody who has a big piece of marble and keeps chipping it away, and by removing stuff, there comes a statue. So I think that can be done with the doctrine of God, and perhaps other ones too. So yeah, I don't understand McKinley to be saying that's, you know, he's proven the resurrection, but I think he said, I can make a strong case for the possibility of the resurrection. I think that
exactly, that's correct.
It helps the warranted aspect, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. Any more on that, McKinley?
I'll stop there. There's another point I want to make, but let other people speak.
Okay, Ladan.
Thank you.
Dr. Bruinsma, thank you so much for the lectures on postmodernism.
By the way, you can call me Reinder. That would make it.
We lost you, Ladan.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
I found that comforting, and as we are talking about accepting evidence, I think I understand faith to be a gift that could be removed. I think the evidence and the Bible stories and all these things used to be very comforting to me. They're not. The evidence is not comforting anymore. And I feel that the Muslim martyrdoms, and there are a lot of people that find, it seems to me, and I have a question, that desperation brings a lot of faith. If there is no more hope that your God lives anymore, would you not desperately hang on to the idea of resurrection and become fervent in it? Do the martyrs believe that they have lost all hope and they become martyrs? I'm not debating the truth of any belief. I'm just saying that there might be a desperation here involved.
Yes. Although, you know, I agree with you that desperation can lead to hope, but it doesn't always do that. It also sometimes leads to more desperation.
Yes.
And, you know, and you started by relating evidence and faith and saying that you're no longer primarily concerned about the evidence, but rather about the meaning that gives comfort to you, right? Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, yes.
And I think that is an important point. Yet at the same time, I would think that, you know, although the evidence, there can be many questions about the evidence, and there can be questions about like we said today, about the historicity of Christ. And maybe there are some things in the Gospels that were slightly differently from how it is described. Could be. You know, my view of inspiration is wide enough to allow for that. But yet, for me at least, the stories would lose to a lot of giving that comfort if there was not some basis in fact for them. So I also try to find some basis in fact, because that moves them out of the realm of, you know, only beautiful stories, but it gives them an extra power, and that would be meaningful for me.
Okay, just a footnote. If Eduardo hangs on, I don't know if he will. I've been thinking about a response to something he said a couple of weeks ago about the canon not being closed. So after we've had this discussion, and if Eduardo stays by, I'd like to talk about that with him. Okay, who's next?
I am in line.
Go ahead, George.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Well, since we insist, I will call you Reinder.
Yes,
for this presentation. It clarified many issues for me. I wonder, though, a couple of things. One is, why was the resurrection kept so secretive? When the best evidence for the resurrection would be Jesus appearing as he was before. But he appeared in a way, in a physical format that he could not be recognized. Actually, Thomas was very smart, I guess, because he would not go just by faith. There's an individual here saying he's Jesus, and well, I want to see some proof of it.
Mm-hmm.
Although the other ones accepted it totally by faith. There was no physical evidence. After the resurrection, everything was faith. So that's one thing that I wondered. The second is, why were the stories about Jesus written so many years after the event? It's a little bugging to me, this gap. Too much of a gap in time. Nowadays, when something happens, well, there's a book right there, even before the event happens. But it took too long. I'm not doubting them. I'm just wondering what would be the rationale behind the time that elapsed and between the event and the record, the registry of it. I never figured that out. Maybe you have something to illuminate me with.
Well, to start with the last questions, why were these Gospels written so late? Well, you know, at first, the apostles believed that Christ would return very, very soon.
All right.
And at first, they probably did not see the need to have these formal documents. Also, this was an oral world in which, you know, stories were, history stories, accounts were transmitted, they were told. As the apostles went around and as there were others who became teachers, they had this collection of stories. Some of these stories were probably put in writing, but circulated as separate units. Now, those who have researched the genesis of the New Testament believe that the Gospel of Mark was the first, and then there were some other sources. There was some source in writing with a number of sayings of Jesus Christ. And then there was some source that the Matthew had access to and some source that Luke had access to, and that gradually the need was felt by these apostles to actually write down something that was destined for different publics. For instance, Matthew was writing in particular for Jewish Christians, whereas Luke was writing for a different audience. So there was a whole story behind, or before, we would say, the actual genesis of the four Gospels as we have them now. Now, not everybody would agree that, you know, inspiration allows for that kind of, but this is more or less the consensus in the scholarly world, that there was this history of the making of the New Testament that went from, let's say, the 40s until the end of the first century. Now, as to the other question, why was it the resurrection kept so secret? Well, yes, could Jesus not have appeared to a larger number of people rather than 500 at most? That is something that Paul refers to, that, by the way, is not mentioned in the Gospels, which is interesting. But could Jesus not have just walked through Jerusalem 40 days, every day, making himself known? Well, it's easy to ask such questions. It's much more difficult to answer them. But Jesus was in a new form. He was the same person, but he had a different kind of body. It was still a physical body. He was not a phantom. He was not a spirit. He was a physical person, but different in a way from what he was. And even the disciples had some problems in understanding that. Now, we'll come to that if you allow me to deal with that next week. The resurrection body of Jesus Christ and the resurrection body that we will eventually have.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, let me get to Dr. Bull. I would like to read what a warranted belief is really quickly here. Okay, this is what Plantinga says a warranted belief is. All right, are you ready? A belief has warrant if and only if it is produced by cognitive faculties functioning properly in a congenial epistemic environment according to a design plan successfully aimed at the production of true belief. Okay, you got that?
Okay, how much time do we have to?
I think if one, I think if one takes that apart line by line, it's actually quite understandable, but reading it straightforward might be not so understandable. Okay, Brian Bull, we need you to unmute yourself.
I think, David, that you could more or less summarize it by a warrant belief should make sense.
Makes sense, all things considered that are available to you, something like that. Okay. All right, Brian.
I'd like to, first of all, Reinder, I appreciate very much the what you have done. And hang on a minute, my phone just started to ring. But what I'd like to do in terms of warranted belief is to go in what may appear to be a counterintuitive direction. I'd like to consider the absence of the presence of life as opposed to death, because you're talking about resurrection. Mm-hmm. Well, by training, I'm a pathologist. I have on many occasions been in an autopsy room with a dead body prior to beginning the task of performing the autopsy. And I've contemplated this dead body, which an hour or two before was a living human being. Everything about that body is, as far as we can tell, the same, but life has left it. Now, supposing we didn't know that life was possible, and supposing, this is obviously going to be a weird world, but we are aware of all the organic materials that now we know go into making a living human being. And somehow, somewhere, somebody told us that we could take all of these things, we could put them together, and something completely novel, life, would then occur. We know that life has occurred because we're alive. But if we didn't know that life had occurred or could occur, would a warranted belief allow us to put together all of the chemicals, all of the elements, and could you explain to somebody that now if you put these all together, you would have life? Mm-hmm. It's the same problem that we're faced with here in terms of bringing life back to a dead body in terms of the resurrection. But the concept of life is still puzzling to us. We don't know what it exists, how it exists, why it exists. Mm-hmm. And we have been studying this problem. I'm a research biologist when I'm not a pathologist. And we don't understand life. We probably don't understand it any better than in the last 200 or 300 years. But we do know that if you get a lot of organic salts and compounds together and put them together in precisely the right mechanism, with precisely the right interrelationships, you can produce something that we call life. It seems to me that warranted belief at this point sort of comes into play. Could we have explained in terms of warranted belief to somebody that you could take inorganic materials and put them together and produce life? Now, we accept life because we're alive. We study it. We're fully familiar with it, but we don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And we don't understand precisely what leaves the body when life leaves it. Mm-hmm. Because everything that was living an hour or two before in this body that's on the table in front of me is still there. Mm-hmm. It's not function, actually. If I were to go into some of the cells, they probably still are alive. And I could cultivate them in tissue culture. But the person, the human being that's before me on this table is not alive. But isn't this just as much a miracle as believing in the resurrection? Yet we take it for granted because we do it every day. At least physicians observe dead bodies and living bodies, and one transmutes into the other. And it seems to me that that is the kind of thing that we don't understand, and yet is just as miraculous and wonderful as believing in the resurrection.
Yeah. Well, I started my little book about I Have a Future with a few pages on the fact that life and death are not as straightforward terms as people sometimes think, and that some of the terms that we use, they are in fact metaphors for something we do not quite understand. As I said last week, when we use the word sleep, it is for want of a better word, because what death exactly is, we don't know. We do know that at least we do believe, and that is what we believe as Seventh-day Adventist Christians and many with us, that there is not a separate entity that can live consciously when separated from the body. But life, Adam, and we leave the question of whether there was a historical Adam or whether that stands for something else, but the Genesis story tells us that God gave man the breath of life. And
we can't hear him.
You can't hear me?
Can you hear him now?
No.
I can.
I can hear.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, McKinley, but others can hear.
Okay.
Reinder, you're continuing about the breath of life going into the formed Adam out of the dust of the ground.
Yeah, and so there is a divine involvement when at the beginning of life. And what we are saying about the resurrection, there has to be a divine involvement there in order to make it happen.
And I agree, and I've read your book, and I thoughtfully provided by David, and that is in fact what we're dealing with. We don't understand when life is present in a body. We don't understand what happens when it's gone. What's missing in the body that's in front of me?
Yeah.
This is a new one on me. Let me see if I can, and this, I'm not challenging you, Brian, I'm just exploring it to get a little closer to the understanding here. But the first thing I notice is that you're using the word life as a noun rather than as a function. So one asks, where is life? Or life was here, or life wasn't here, now it is. That's using the word as a noun rather than a function. I suppose one could say life is just the organism functioning well. There is no such thing as life. There is only living. But that's first. I'm just asking: Are we in this conversation using the word life as a noun? And then, if we are, all those issues you raise are really, really, they make, if there's life here, but there's not life here, that's an interesting matter worth thinking about. What would you like to say?
Are you asking Brian?
Yes, just for a moment.
Yeah.
Brian, we need you to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying the use of terms. I have gone from you're correct. As a research biologist, I spend my days looking at living cells. A living cell is a cell that can take in nutrients, can grow, often can divide, and an unliving cell is the same thing that now no longer can bring nutrients in across a semi-permeable membrane, grow, divide, multiply, etc. We define viruses as non-living because they need the machinery in a cell for life. Well, a living person or a living human being is a collection of billions and billions of these cells all functioning smoothly. So when this process of movement of molecules across semi-permeable membrane from outside to inside and inside to outside ceases, we say that the life is no longer present in this cell, in this organ, or in this person. So that's the way in which I'm using the term life. And we don't understand it as biologists, but we accept it. We spend our lives playing around with it. And philosophically, when I step into an autopsy room and look at a dead body on the autopsy table in front of me, and know that this person was alive 2 hours ago and now isn't, I'm forced to philosophically consider, what is it that's different here?
Yeah, I'm going to try a really crude illustration or analogy. And if it's anywhere close, let me know. But if it's totally off, let me know too, okay? Suppose you have an automobile and all the parts are there, but it doesn't go anywhere until there's a spark provided, right? So all the constituent parts of an automobile don't get that automobile to do anything. In effect, the automobile is dead until the spark of life energizes it. Is that anywhere near what you're talking about?
No.
Okay.
May I offer a suggestion?
No.
I wonder if I can.
All right, try me again.
Dave, can I come? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That's not the problem. We know that at least we understand all of the processes involved in getting that automobile running. We need to vaporize some gasoline. We need to compress it. Then we need to put a spark in it. And then we need to take the resulting explosion and use it and a whole bunch more explosions to get the car running. What we don't understand is the difference between the dead body that I'm looking at and what it was like 2 hours ago. We don't know what's left. And we do know that at some point in the past, that presumably this was infused into the body, animals, into plants. And that's the problem we're dealing with in the resurrection. And that's what Reinder started. That's why he started out talking about the nature of life being absent, and it's known as death.
David.
Okay. Let's see. Eduardo, I need you to mute your.
Can I say something here?
Yes. I lost whose track. Who just said that? Was that McKinley?
I do want to say something, but somebody else is wanting to talk.
It was Eduardo that was talking.
Oh, that was Eduardo?
Yes.
Okay, Eduardo, you're in line. Professor Boscovich is next, I think. And after that, we'll get to Eduardo. We need you to, Melania, that's not your name, but that's your, that's the way you're here. We need you to unmute if you want to talk. Okay, he's not responding. Reinder, do you want to say anything about what's been going on so far?
No, I found this what Brian just said very interesting and important, and that is that life is a secret, and so far we have not been able to decode exactly what life is, and we cannot be expected to, because it's a divine gift that was given to stuff that was not alive, making them alive, and that brings us to the resurrection, where we need the divine intervention to make that happen. And whether you believe that that can happen, well, that's what we have been talking about.
And yeah, I think it's easier to believe that that can happen if you realize that we haven't a clue what life is.
Yeah.
And we live quite happily knowing that. I mean,
yeah.
we don't have sleepless nights because we don't.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you.
So,
okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You know, it seems to me it's that warranted belief again. In the case of life, we can believe it because we've seen it, but if we had never seen it, it would be very difficult to explain to somebody how all of these inorganic molecules, if you put them all together, you now have life.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for making that point. Yeah.
That's I need to think about it some more, obviously. Let's see, Professor Boscovich. I need you to, go ahead.
I believe we have a problem because we're confusing some of the issues. First of all, we're very familiar with the issues of emergent properties. For example, the properties of oxygen and the properties of hydrogen are very much changed. In fact, it is totally difficult for us to predict why the properties of water would be the way they are based on the properties of oxygen and hydrogen from which the water is formed. Do you see? The combination of events at one level generates emergent properties at the next level. So life is an emergent properties of a series of orders which are participating together to make it possible. As an emergent property, it functions at a higher level from the constituent components that form it. They have to. It cannot be any other way.
Okay, so let's now pull that back to the resurrection. How does life?
We're talking about, yes, now we're talking about the issue of life, for example.
Mm-hmm.
At the foundation of everything that is, at the foundation of matter itself, in the view of current physics, lies information. And the interesting thing when this is being said, as coined by John Wheeler, it from bit, that suggests to us at the base, at the core of everything that is information. That reminds us of John chapter 1, verses 1-3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and through it everything was created. That tells us that there is a higher reality over and above and under the physical reality that we're most familiar with. we, for example, do not even know how to even start learning anything. I mean, when a baby's born, it doesn't even know that it's sucking its thumb when it sucks its thumb. It just learns that it's doing that after a while. And the reason why we have a problem with this is because we want direct instructions to go to direct outcomes. But even in computer programming, we now know that it is possible to create computer programs with what's known as reduced instruction set, which does not create a program that will have all the outcomes specified. It will only create a program with the possibility of learning so that it can then discover what it needs to do.
Okay, now I'd like to back up. Go ahead.
These are many different aspects, all of which play into the issue of how life comes about.
Okay, I'd like us to back up a little bit, not physically, but conceptually. Let's back up and notice what's happening here. I think this is what's happening. We've had 3 analogies so far, more may come up, which open up the possibility of a resurrection without establishing its facticity, right? We began with the idea of entropy and it being reversed. Then we have the idea of life and how our understanding or limited understanding of that breaks open the possibility that there could be life in a resurrection situation. And now we're talking about life as an emergent property. Now all of these are different ways of, and there are, I'm sure, more, but these are different ways of saying your steadfast conviction that a resurrection is impossible is worthy of review. And so I think there's a pattern here that's emerging in the discussion that we should know. The discussion is just not a bunch of ad hoc statements. There is a kind of a trend that's developing, and it's worth noting. Eduardo.
David, thank you. When I was listening, I thought from Sister White came to my mind, and I just wanted to kind of quote her. She said, God created works are a mystery as his existence. And I think that mystery, it cannot be explained in this world. Let me repeat it. God's created works are a mystery as his existence. And about resurrection, I think the resurrection is a supernatural action. And basically we are dealing with a natural world, not a supernatural world. I think that we are talking about 2 different issues.
Okay, so I think this fits in with what we've been discussing very nicely, because each of the models we've had so far, namely about entropy and about life and about emergent properties, leave room for that mystery, right? That there is something. Yeah. There's that mystery that we get so far, and then it is mysterious. That kind of mystery is different than an absurdity, right? It's one thing to say the resurrection has a mysterious aspect to it that we will never be able to penetrate, but that's different from saying the idea of a resurrection is in principle an absurdity. So I don't think she's using the word, and I'm not suggesting that you are. I just think it's important to make a distinction between a mystery on the one hand and absurdity on the other hand. Do you want to respond to that, Eduardo?
Well, I think that it become absurd if history do not tell us that many people witnessed the resurrection. It will be absurdity if we don't have the Bible history.
Okay, okay.
Dave,
So
I'd like
that-
to get back in when you have a moment.
Okay, let's see if Reinder wants to talk about something. It's just presentation. We've run away with it.
No. I just wanted to emphasize that actually many of the things that have just been said, they do not, give any proof for the resurrection, but they all help us to tell those people who say, no, this cannot have happened, that they should not be too quick to say that, because there are quite a few arguments that make it not as impossible as it might seem to them. So the idea of the resurrection should not be dismissed too quickly by those who say no.
Right, so on the one hand, they shouldn't be too dismissive because there are a lot of things we don't understand. On the other hand, there are some analogies that might point in a direction that is conceptually helpful. All of that, what that does is to keep the discussion going rather than having it cut off by some presupposition that just stalls the whole conversation. Who was next? McKinley.
McKinley, yes. So this is beautiful because I've given a lot of thought to this topic. And the 3 conversations we've had so far, I think are tied together by this whole idea of an amplified first law of thermodynamics. And this is where you combine information, energy, and matter. So Dr. Bull talked about energy in terms of the nutrients being able to be introduced into a cell. And the other professor, Melina, I think, talked about these emergent properties. But all of that is tied together in Psalms 33, verse 6, where it says, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. In that text, we find God's action in creating life, and in the case of this resurrection that we're talking about, being brought about either through Christ's resurrection or in the resurrection that we anticipate as Christians as a result of our belief in the Lord.
Okay, now I'm going to say all of this. Okay, it's all very interesting. I find it fascinating, very helpful. But when I was a child, we sang a song, I think it went, he lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, Christ Jesus lives in my heart.
Amen.
Right? And so that's a different avenue to this issue, and that is to say, I know he lives because the resurrected Christ is active in my own life in ways that I can discern. I mean, that's a. I'm not going to. I don't know that we have to choose between the two, but I do think that when I get up in the morning, I'm not going to say to myself, I'm so glad that I have the promise that I will be helped through this day because of the second law of thermodynamics. I think that
this is true, David, and that's, I think, is the beautiful nature of the Christian experience, the salvation project. God simplifies it to the faith exercise. The believer on the continent of Africa doesn't have to understand the amplified laws of thermodynamics. The child in primary doesn't have to understand any of these complications or complex issues. All they have to do is to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved and receive that eternal life. And so all of this conversation is very interesting, as you say, but at bottom, it comes down to, do we believe that God raised Christ from the dead? And as Paul argues in Corinthians, without that outcome, our faith is in vain.
Yeah, I agree. So long we don't think it's a good idea forever to be in kindergarten in our understanding of the Christian walk. Some people take that position. You're not taking that position.
No.
but you are underlining the fact that the cake might be worth eating even if we don't know how all the ingredients came together on it. But a chef wants to know that.
Yes.
Okay. Somebody else here. Reinder.
We want to think about these things because we are thinking human beings, and we are told to love the Lord our God with all our mind. But at the same time, I think it's also important to once in a while come back to the statement that you just made, David, that in the end it is what happens in our inner being. Karl Barth once came to the University of Chicago. You may have heard that story. And journalists came and talked to him and said, Dr. Barth, could you just please, you are such a giant of theology, could you just please, in a few lines, tell us what theology is all about? And he says, I can tell you that Jesus loves me. Yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. And that was a summary for him, of what it boils down to. And I think that that is the kind of step that we must from time to time take and say, okay, it's good that we discuss these things and that we try to wrap our minds around some of these things, but we have to be humble enough to say that we really don't know. We are guessing. Well, in faith, we're trying to touch what the truth is. And okay, even if we got some things wrong, Jesus loves us. Yes, we know, for the Bible tells us so. And Jesus.
Okay, just to make your point, Reinder, here is Volume 2, Part 2 of Barth's Church Dogmatics. All right.
Yes.
This is the second half of one volume. I think it's 800 pages long. And then there are, I think, 4 volumes to the set as a whole, or maybe 5. I forgot. So if you can summarize all this in those few words, that's fine. I do think if you've never seen the risen Christ transform lives today, this is really, really hard. But if you have experienced a power within you, and if you've seen a power like that at work in the lives of people, bringing about positive transformation, then you're willing to say, well, maybe there's something going on here. That's where Bultmann got stuck, right? Bultmann saying, well, I know the Christ of faith in my heart. But people would say to him, well, how do you know that that's connected to the first century Jesus? Because you are so skeptical about that. And that's what created the second and the third quest for the historical Jesus. We do, I think, experience something of a positive, there's something positive going on in our lives, and we dare to call that Christ and connected with Jesus. Mm-hmm. Okay, who is next? Yes, sir.
Something.
Okay.
Could we
Go
just
ahead.
recall when we were first in love? Didn't that experience make life all of a sudden appear very, very different from everything up to that point? It's like contrasting pictures in black and white to suddenly seeing everything in Technicolor. So what is it that makes that difference? And why is it that Jesus calls us to remember the first love?